Being with us. Appreciate all of you watching us on our Facebook page or website or wherever you're at with us. And we would like to invite you to come be with us in person, 6:30 on Wednesday night, 10:15 on Sunday morning, 6 o'clock on Sunday night. We love to have you. Tonight we're in Ezekiel chapter 24. And so if you turn to Ezekiel 24, this is the last section really on God's judgments on Israel and Judah. We've been looking at 24 chapters now where God has given Ezekiel a message for Israel and Judah. And it's all been future. He's been telling them that these things are coming. The Babylonians are coming. Nebuchadnezzar's coming. Chapter 24, they're here. So chapter 24 is a present judgment. It's not future anymore. It's present. And so God is going to, in chapter 24, when we get into this, you're going to see when we get halfway through this, God asked these prophets to do some really uncomfortable things. And what he asked Ezekiel to do, I think, will be one of the toughest ever. And you'll see when we get there. But he's going to tell him in chapter 24, there's one parable, and then there's two what we call action sermons. So he's going to give us a parable first, and then he's going to act out a sermon in two ways. And the ways he acts these sermons out are what I think is just really tough for God to ask somebody to do. But chapter 24, like I say, up until now, Ezekiel's been predicting that judgment would fall on the future. The day's finally come. All right. So when we start in chapter 24, it coincides with the invasion of Babylon. So as he's telling them this, the Babylonians are storming the city. All right. So it's all happening at the same time. So look at verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th of the month. So he tells you exactly when it happens. So you can read this, and there's really one accepted date for this, and then there's a handful of scholars that predict another date. They're not far off, but the more general date to this thing, because the first three verses kind of like the background to it. The more generally accepted date is January the 15th, 586 BC. So when he goes through those months and dates, he's talking about January the 15th, 586 BC. That is the date that Babylon invaded. That's the invasion of Judah, when Judah falls. Israel, the northern kingdom, fell in 722 BC. So here we are about almost 200 years later, and Judah's going to fall to the Babylonians. All right? There are some scholars, a handful of them, that say that date is January the 5th, 587 BC. So that they think it may be a year earlier. The more common accepted date is January 15, 586 BC. But the important part is, look what God says to him. He says, it came to me on the 9th year, 10th month, 10th of the month, saying, Son of man, write the name of the day this very day. So he asked Ezekiel right up front to mark this day down. This is the day, this is when it's going to happen, and he says, I want you to permanently mark this day. This day, I don't want you to forget. I want it recorded. I want you to know that this is when this happened. Now, it is the day that the siege began. It's the beginning of the siege. So he says, mark this down. In verse 2, write the name of the day, this very day. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. So as he's telling them this, when he's talking to the exiles, as he's telling them this, Nebuchadnezzar storming Jerusalem. So all these folks are in Jerusalem, they think they're safe, and he's been telling them they're not, for 24 chapters. And then these exiles out here that are going to be exiles anyway, he's telling them this is what's going to happen. Now he's saying this is happening. This is the day. God said, mark it down. Nebuchadnezzar is entering into Jerusalem this day. This day is when it's all going to happen. So verse 3, speak a parable. This is the parable. Speak a parable to the rebellious house, as Judah. They're no longer the house of God. They're no longer the innocent house. God's now calling the rebellious house. And say to them, thus saith the Lord God, put on the pot, put it on, and also pour water in it. All right, so that's kind of the background to this parable. And the second part of verse 3, where it tells them to put on the pot, that starts the actual parable. So the background is, it happens January 15th, 586 BC. God said, mark this day down. This is the day that Nebuchadnezzar comes into Jerusalem. And then he starts the parable. And he says, here's the parable. Put on a pot, big boiling pot, put it on a fire, and pour water in it. And then verse 4, put it in the pieces, put in it the pieces, every good piece, the thigh, the shoulder, fill it with choice bones, take the choices of the flock, and also pile wood under the pot, make it boil vigorously, also seethe its bones in it. So this is the parable. In the parable, the people are supposed to put a bronze cooking pot. We don't know what's bronze yet until we get down to verse 11. But he says, I want you to put a bronze cooking pot on the fire, put water in it, and then this is going to be one of those large pots that has two handles. It has a deep, a basin that's got a wide mouth to it. And he says, oh, you put this on the fire, put it on on top of the fire, put water in it. Then he says, in this parable, the people are going to put the choicest types of meat into the pot. So you're going to have this pot, you're going to boil water in this big, huge pot, and then the people are going to throw the meat into the pot. All right, now, if you look at this, and as we trace this out, there's no evidence that they actually did it. This is not one of those action sermons. This is not something, it appears anyway, that this is not something that Ezekiel actually did. There's no indication in here, there's no evidence in here that they actually put a pot up and put meat in it. It was spoken. It's a parable. He's telling them this because he's going to make a point about what's going on. And so he says, I want you to get this pot, put water in it, and put these various pieces of choice meat into this pot, build a strong fire under it, water's going to boil, and those choices of meats are going to cook. All right? Now, verses 3b, where he talks about putting on the pot, all the way down through verse 13 is another one of those songs. If you remember, chapter 21 was the sword song. It was poetic. It was almost like it was set that it could be sung. It was about Nebuchadnezzar coming in with a sword and killing all the people. In chapter 23, it's the cup song. This one is most, when you look at theological commentaries, they call it the cooking pot song. It's written the same way. It's in this poetic form. It could be set to music. It's a different type of literature. It's a different type of writing. But he tells them to do this. Again, there's no evidence that he actually did it. He could have. I mean, we don't have evidence that he didn't do it. But this is one that God says, speak this to them. Say this to them. He didn't say, go out and do it. He said, say this. He said, say and tell them, give them this example. All right, now, verse 6. Verse 6 is going to start the reason for it. All right, so look at verse 6. And we'll read down through verse 8. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, woe to the bloody city, to the pot in which there is rust, and whose rust is not gone out of it. Take out of it piece after piece, without making a choice, for her blood is in her midst. She placed it on a bare rock. She has not poured on the ground to cover it with dust, that it may cause wrath to come up to take vengeance. I have put her blood on the bare rock, that it may be covered. Now, so Ezekiel says, here's the parable. All right, you get this cooking pot, put these choices of meat in it, build a fire, boil the meat, all these kind of things. Now he's announcing judgment on, look what he calls them in verse 6, the bloody city. He says a bloody city. It's no longer the holy city. It's a bloody city. All right. It's, in other words, God's done. The pot represents the city. That's what he's kind of telling us. This pot represents the city. The pot had rust. The rust represents the blood of the people who were killed there. All right. So he said this is the pot. The pot represents the city, and the rust represents the blood. All right. It on one level, in the parabolic sense, it's a representation of the blood from the meat that's cooking in the pot. But really, what God is referring to is the blood of the people. All right, the sacrifice of the people. And so he says, look at verses 6 through 8. Taking out of it piece after piece without making a choice. In verse 6. Take out of it piece after piece without making a choice. Ezekiel, they're going to put all this meat in his pot. And then Ezekiel pulls out pieces without being selective, really. He's not looking through and specifically hand picking them. He's just randomly picking out pieces of meat. When he does that, it's signifying to the people, and he's going to kind of explain this later. It's signifying to the people that all these people are in Jerusalem. This pot represents Jerusalem. The meat that's thrown into the pot represents the people who are going to be judged. And then Ezekiel's pulling out pieces of it, signifying that God is going to spare a remnant from the city. Not all of them are going to die. Some of them God will spare. And so that's verse 6. Look at verse 7. Blood, and here's this is a symbolic reference to the temple. Look what he says in verse 7. For her blood is in her midst. She placed it on the bare rock. She did not pour it out on the ground to cover it with dust. Blood was in Jerusalem's midst, in the city of Jerusalem, just like the blood of a sacrifice at the temple. The conditions for the priest in the Levitical sacrifices, the conditions for the priest was when they made the sacrifice, they drained the blood off and then they covered it with dust. And he said in verse 7, her blood, Jerusalem's blood, is in the midst. It's there. It has not been covered up. It hadn't been drained off. It's there. In other words, if you walk to the Old Testament tabernacle or the temple, and you see the altar out front, if you see the blood on the altar, that's a no-no. They drain it off, they cover it up, so the altar stays kind of intact, almost, kind of pristine looking. Well, if the blood is still on there, then that really signifies, because the blood represents the sins of the people. Yeah, that's why you're killing the sacrifice. You're sacrificing an animal for the sins of the people. And so if the blood is still on the altar, that is indicative of, or it symbolizes that there's the sins. I mean, you can see the sin. So the priests were told to get all the blood off and cover it up so that it would symbolically say that God has erased the sin. Sin's gone. Now he says inside of Jerusalem, the blood is inside of Jerusalem, just like the sacrifice at the temple on the altar that has not been drained off and hadn't been covered up. In other words, here's what he's saying. The sins of all the people of Jerusalem are open for everybody to see. Nobody's hiding it. Nobody's getting away with it. God sees it all, and it's all bare for them. And so this is kind of the reasoning behind the judgment. God said, I want you to give them this parable. Tell them that the city's like a cauldron, and the meat's being put in there. The meat's boiling, but I'm going to save some of the meat out. That's the people. People are going to die. Nebuchadnezzar, this very day, is coming to invade. But I'm going to save some of them. I'm going to pull some of them out. And then he says, the reason I'm doing this is because their sins are wide open. I mean, they're open about it. It's really blatant. It's really obvious. It's kind of in your face kind of stuff. And he says, I'm going to do that. Now, Jerusalem's a city now that has shed a lot of blood. God's not happy with that. But it was also, in this sense, an unacceptable sacrifice. God said, even if I wanted to say, I'll take what you've been doing, you didn't do it the right way. It's unacceptable to me. All right, so this is it. So now look what God is saying. In verse 8, God is now going to take over. That it may cause wrath to come up to take vengeance. I have put her blood on the bare rock that it may be covered. Now what God is saying is, I'm going to now drain the blood out of Jerusalem by allowing the Babylonians to come in and kill them. That's how I'm going to get rid of the sin, the innocent blood that the Jerusalemites and the Judahites had taken, those innocent people they killed, child sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. Now, just like Abel's in Genesis, their blood is crying out for vengeance, and God says, this is their vengeance. I'm going to send the Babylonians in now to purify the city. And he's going to come in and he's going to take all this out. And so as the people of Jerusalem had sinned openly and they had taken lives, they shed blood, all that, now God is going to shed blood openly, and he's going to take their life for what they did. Because they're living in this just open abomination and open sin. So God said in verse 8, you're a bloody city, the blood's there, the sin's open, you guys have killed innocent blood, you shed innocent blood, now I'm going to come in and exact vengeance on you. That's those first 8 verses. Now you get to verse 9. Verse 9 now is the results of it. What happens when God does this? Because God doesn't punish just to be punished. And, I've told you that. When God judges us, it's always restorative. It's always to bring us back. It's always to get us back on the right path. God is not just arbitrary. God is not just capricious. He just doesn't do things to us to do things to us. There's always a reason for it. So verse 9 starts the reasoning. And so this is really, verse 9, a second oracle. The first one is the boiling pot parable. This is kind of a second oracle kind of thing. And so now that God has all this sins in there, all this sin is open, all these innocent people have been killed, all this stuff's been happening in Jerusalem, God's going to send Nebuchadnezzar in. All right, Nebuchadnezzar comes, Babylonians are coming this day, and they're just going to wipe out the city. All right, now, what happens next? What does God do next? Look at verse 9. Therefore saith the Lord of God, woe to the bloody city! I also will make the pile great, heap on the wood, kindle the fire, boil the flesh well, mix in the spices, and let the bones be burned. God is now pronouncing woe on this city, or judgment on this city, and he says, I'm going to make the piles of bones in Jerusalem, these slain inhabitants, great. In other words, a lot of people's going to die in Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar comes in. Now, Ezekiel now is told to kindle a strong fire. You got to get a fire going. Boil the meat well. Mix in the spices. That's what he's saying in verse 9 and 10. Mix in these spices. That's the way they normally cook meat. And then he said, just let the bones burn. You go ahead and put the fire on, throw in the meat, put the spices on, and let the bones burn. And these bones are going to burn. This is going to symbolize for them the fierceness of this attack, how bad it's going to be. It's just going to eradicate people. All right, so that's those 2 verses. Now, verse 11. Then set it empty on its coals, so that it may be hot, and its bronze may glow, and its filthiness may be melted in it, and its rust consumed. After these bones burn, Ezekiel is then told to empty the pot, get all that stuff out, and put it back on the coals. Empty pot, put the pot back on the hot coals. With the fire burning under it, then that fire now on this empty pot is going to burn out all the impurities. He's going to burn it clean. And he says that this little pot illustration is symbolic of what's going to happen physically starting today in Jerusalem. You guys are full of sin. The meat represents you guys. The blood represents your sin and all the innocent blood you shed. Now Babylon's going to come in. They're going to kill everybody, and I'm just going to let it burn. I'm going to let them do their thing. I'm going to let them kill people. I'm going to let them just burn the city. And he says, then, Ezekiel, in this illustration, you're going to take this pot. The pot represents Jerusalem. You put the pot back on the fire without the people in it, without that stuff in it. And then the fire is going to burn out the impurities. In other words, God said, the reason I'm doing this is I'm purifying this city, making it holy again. I'm consecrating it again. It's got all impure. It's got all messed up from sin. It's polluted. It's bad. And so now all this uncleanliness in it, God says, I'm going to now, just like Ezekiel, you're putting it on this fire. God said, I'm using Babylon as the fire. Nebuchadnezzar is the fire, and he's going to come in and physically what he does, light it on fire and burn the city down. He says, I'm going to use him now to purify out all the bad stuff, all the uncleanliness, all these idol worshipers, all this sexual perversion, all this child sacrifice, all this stuff's going on in my holy city. God said, today's the day it ends. I'm getting rid of all that stuff, and I'm going to purify it back to myself. That's why he said for Ezekiel to take some of the meat out of the pot, because God says, I'm going to spare some of the people. There will be a remnant left. And then he says, when all this gets cleaned up and this pot gets purified again, which is Jerusalem, then you can go back. And so that's where we get into Nehemiah and Ezra. And that God says to them, okay, it's time now. Jerusalem can be rebuilt. We can start over again. So they all move back and they rebuild the city, they rebuild the walls, they rebuild the temple, because God has now cleansed it from its uncleanliness by using the Babylonians to do it. That's the illustration that he's trying to make here. Now look at verse 12. She, talking about Jerusalem, she has wearied me with toil, yet her great rust has not gone from her. Let her rust be in the fire. Jerusalem is worried God to death, and he has worked to get rid of the sin. He's tried, sent prophets, all these things. And so now the city is going to be under judgment until all that sin can be purged away. That's verse 12. Verse 13. In your filthiness is lewdness, because I would have cleansed you, yet you're not clean. You will not be cleansed from your filthiness again until I have spent my wrath on you. All right, so adultery takes a lot of forms, and that's what he's talking about in verse 13. Filthiness, lewdness. He's talking about adultery, and what God's saying is, and I mean, he can say the same thing to us. God said that this adultery, this sexual perversion that's going on in this city, has clung to you. You won't let it go. You keep on. Even though, look what God says, I've tried, I've sent, I've told, he says. What he means is, I've sent prophet after prophet. I've sent people to tell you. You won't listen to them. They've told you that this is not good, that this is the wrong way, that this is the wrong way. Clean yourself up and get right, And he says, you're not listening. So look what he says at the end of this verse. You will not be cleansed from your filthiness again until I've spent my wrath on you. In other words, God said, I can't just keep sending prophets. It's not working. You're not listening. You're not hearing. So God said, you're not going to be cleansed again. It's not going to be right again until I pour out my wrath on you, until the Babylonians come, because you're not listening. I mean, I could keep sending people, and I could keep sending people, but you're just going to keep rejecting them. The only way I can get through to you now is to send Nebuchadnezzar over here and burn the place down, start all over again. It's the only way I can get through to you. Sometimes people today are like that. Sometimes God gives us choices and chances and speaks to us and convicts us, and we just keep putting him on, and then God has to send a tragedy into our life to make us realize what we're missing out on and what we've neglected. And it's kind of going to happen to Ezekiel to some extent, which is why I say it's pretty hard here. Now, because they've kept being resistant, now it's time for a thorough cleansing. It's really what he's talking about in verse 13. It's a thorough cleansing. God's wrath is going to be here because, and kind of look at it this way, the water, the prophets haven't been really effective, so now the fire's coming. All right? So that's how we're going to get it. So verse 14, God wraps up this little section, this first section. I, the Lord, have spoken. It's coming. I will act. I will not relent. I will not pity. I will not be sorry. According to your ways and according to your deeds, I will judge you, declares the Lord God. So God, in conclusion, God said, this is happening. At this point now, there's nothing going to change my mind. I'm not going to back off. Moses is not going to intercede, with some great intercessory prayer like he did before. Ezekiel's not going to do, nobody's going to stop it. I'm coming to you now in judgment. It's happening today. That's why he told Ezekiel to mark it down. Matter of fact, Jews still have a feast day correlating with this day that remembers the invasion. All right, now, so that's the parable. That's the first section. The second section starts in verse 15. And there are two signs. I always like to call them pedagogian biographies. They are lived out teaching examples. They're action sermons. They're not really words. They're actions. They're things that happen. And so God is about to give Ezekiel one that I think, if any married man in here is going to agree with me, be one of the hardest things you're ever asked to do. Look at verse 15 now. This is the first sign. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, behold, I'm about to take from you the desire of your eyes with a blow, but you shall not mourn, and you shall not weep, and your tears shall not come. We'll get into verse 17. But look what he says now. He says in verse 15 and 16, I'm about to take from you the desire of your eyes. It's his wife. He's telling Ezekiel his wife's going to die. All right, and look how he says it. Well, let me say this first. I'll say this. He says with a blow, and when we think of, and that's an English translation. When we think of blow, we think of sudden, unexpected, that kind of thing. It's not necessarily what the Hebrew word means. The Hebrew word doesn't demand it be sudden and unexpected. Can be, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily that way. So when they translate this into English, they use the word blow, and it gives us a pretty narrow connotation of what it's like. Because I don't think it was sudden and unexpected. I think there was other things to play here. But look what he says. Here's the tough part. I'm about to take your wife, but you're not going to mourn. He said, I want you to cry. You're not going to weep. You're not going to be sorrowful. You're not going to show any emotion. Now, how hard would that be? How hard of a ministry assignment is it for God to say to a man, your wife's fixing to die, but you're not going to show any emotion over it. I don't want you to grieve. I don't want you to mourn. I don't want you to cry. I don't want you to show any outward visible signs of this thing. So when you read that verse and you say that, it makes you think, does God generally do that kind of stuff just to make a point? Well, not so much. I mean, I don't think it's so much that God acts cruelly to make a point. I think sometimes God allows things to happen to make a point. I don't think God intentionally does bad things, you know. I think God sometimes allows things to happen or directs things to happen in his providence. And let me say it like this. I think Ezekiel's wife's probably been sick for a while. I think that's what this is implying. There's no way to know unless we can talk to God and ask him, or Ezekiel and ask him. I think it implies that she'd been sick for a while. And I think that the wording of this little sign is that God allowed her now to die at this precise time. It's like Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time, when the timing was right, God sent his son. God knew the exact time to send Jesus. I think God knew the exact time that Ezekiel's wife was going to die. She'd been sick, probably, and Ezekiel probably knew that, but now God says, okay, today's it. You know, as a matter of fact, she dies the next day that he says it. And he says, your wife's going to die. She's about to breathe her last, but don't react. Don't mourn or do any of that kind of stuff. And I still say that's a pretty tough assignment. All right, look at here's where I think especially lost people get messed up. Just because God controls the time of every person's death, which I think he does. I think everybody has a numbered day, and I don't think there's anything you can do to change it. I don't think you know when it is, but I don't think there's anything you can do to change it. I think that we try to protect ourselves and do the best we can, you know, through things like COVID or things like the flu or cancer or whatever it may be. We try to protect. We wear seatbelts in cars. We try to do our best to protect ourselves. But when your days are up, your days are up. Now, it's providentially God's timing. God's timing is precise and exact. But just because God controls people's death dates doesn't mean we can accuse God of being cruel. Every day that we have is a blessing, and we would use it for the best that we can to honor Him. And so when God says, I'm going to take your wife, I mean, instinctively we look at that and think, well, that's cruel, man. God's going to kill that man's wife just to prove some kind of point to the people in Jerusalem. But that's not really what it's about. God is just going to use that, and she was probably sick to death anyway. But look at verse 17. Look what he says to him. Groan silently, inwardly. Make no mourning for the dead. Bind on your turban, put your shoes on your feet, and do not cover your mustache, and do not eat the bread of men. I don't know if you catch that, but those are customary acts of mourning. A man would take his turban off. He'd cover up his mustache. He'd go barefoot. He'd rub ashes on his face. He'd mourn with people, with his friends and family. Matter of fact, they were known to, and it was customary for them when a death in the family, they would have a mourning ceremony with their family, their friends, and paid mourners. And the more money you had, the more mourners you could come, bigger your funeral was. You look more privileged. And so God said to Ezekiel, I want you to groan silently, mourn inside. Don't do any of that stuff. Put your turban on your head. Don't paint up your face with ash. Don't take your sandals off. Don't cover your mustache. Don't eat the bread alone of men, which is a modest meal they had after fasting. They fast after the dead, and then they eat this little modest meal. God said, I don't want you to do any of that stuff. In other words, this is what God's saying to him. When your wife passes, don't act normally. I want you to act abnormally. And so when everybody in the little village is watching you, they're going to say, why ain't he acting right? Why is he not mourning like we're supposed to mourn? He's not fasting. He's not covering his mustache. He's not taking a turban off his head. He's not doing any of that stuff. What's wrong with this man? And God's point is that's exactly what I want you to do. So I want you to draw attention to yourself acting abnormally, because there's a point behind this, that there's something I'm going to do. So look at verse 18 and 19 now. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening my wife died. All right? So God took her. In the morning I did as I was commanded. The people said to me then, will you not tell us what these things that you're doing mean for us? So on the morning of the next day, Ezekiel addressed the people. That night his wife died, just like God had promised. Ezekiel then faithfully did what God commanded him to do. No mourning, no exhibition, none of that kind of stuff. And his actions bewildered the exiles. That's what this is talking about. This exilic community that he's ministering to, they said, please tell us why you're acting like this. It's not right. We want to know. And so here's the point about Ezekiel that, and I think the point about Ezekiel is a broader point about me and you. Ezekiel, think about this now, everything he's been through. Ezekiel's whole life is a testimony to those exiles. His whole life. Everything God's asked him to do has been a testimony to God's word for those exiles. Lay on your side for 300 and some days, flip over to the other side, don't speak, build this little mound, build this temple, build this thing, roast your food over animal dung, everything he was asked to do was a testimony for these exiles. That's exactly what God's asking me and you to do. He's asking us to make our lives a testimony to unbelievers. Everything we do ought to point to Jesus. It ought to show people that we are the Lord's, that we're different, that we're called out. We're not perfect, not better than they are. We just belong to the Lord. And everything that we do, our actions, our attitudes, ought to be a living example to people that don't know Jesus. That's kind of the correlation. That's the spiritual kind of counterpoint to all this. So now look at verse 20 and 21. Then I said to them, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, speak to the house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am about to profane my sanctuary, the pride of your power, the desire of your eyes, and the delight of your soul, and your sons and your daughters, whom you have left behind, will fall by the sword. So he said, Ezekiel, what's wrong? Why are you acting like this? Ezekiel said, God said he's about to destroy the temple. All right? That's what he's talking about here. Profane the holy temple. I'm getting rid of the temple. And all your relatives that are in Jerusalem, you guys are going to be the exiles, but all those people are left behind. God said he's going to kill them. He said, so they said, why are you acting like this? Your wife died and you're not mourning. You're not doing the right thing. And he said, okay, because God told me to tell you that he's about to kill your relatives in Jerusalem and destroy the temple. Here's why he said that. The Jews loved the temple like Ezekiel loved his wife. And so he says to them, the way I feel about her is the way you guys feel about that temple. Well, it's fixing to be gone. It's fixing to be destroyed. And so God's message to you is, you're going to do like me. You're going to hold back your grieving over it until God shows you otherwise. That's what he says in verse 22 and 23 and 24. Look at verse 22. You will do as I've done. You follow my example. You will not cover your mustache. You will not eat the bread of men. Your turbans will be on your heads, your shoes on your feet. You will not mourn, you will not weep, but you will rot away in your iniquities, and you will groan to one another. Thus Ezekiel will be a sign to you, according to all that he has done, you will do. When it comes, then you will know that I am the Lord God. So he said, you guys are to react to your tragic loss just like I did to mine. The same kind of thing. No outward groaning, no tears, no weeping, no covering your mustache, all that kind of stuff. In other words, this is what what he's implying here. You have no right to weep over Jerusalem's destruction because their destruction was deserved. They didn't deserve to get off. And so I don't want you crying for them because it was the righteous thing to do. I had to do this because I'm trying to cleanse it. And so the kind of the opposite of this is Ezekiel had a right to mourn his undeserved personal loss, but he didn't do it. He had a right to. He didn't deserve that. His wife just died. The Israelites had no right to mourn for this kind of well-earned or well-deserved national loss of their city and their temple. And they could not. God told them not to do that, to refrain from it. Jeremiah did the same thing. If you look at Jeremiah prophesied to these people and wept over these people after the fact. That's the book of Lamentations. Jeremiah, he prophesied. He said, listen, this is what God said. Don't fight. Don't resist. Let them come. God said this is part of the plan. He's going to come in. He's going to destroy Jerusalem. But you guys can repent. You have a chance. Please repent. Well, nobody repented. I told you last week, that's why they call him the weeping prophet. Nobody repented. Nobody came to Jesus. And so while all this destruction was going on, while this siege was taking place, Jeremiah stayed quiet, didn't say anything. And so he wasn't disobedient to God. While the siege was happening, he didn't say a word. Afterwards, when it was all over with, then he wrote the book of Lamentations, and he said, now I can grieve over the loss of my city and my people because it's over now. I didn't disobey God. He told me not to do this while it was going on, but now that it's over, now I'm going to write this next book, my lamentation over the city. So that's what Jeremiah did. Now watch verse 25. Verse 25, because this will get into the second action sermon. Right, the first action sermon is his wife dying and him not reacting to it. Now there's a second action sermon. Look at verse 25. As for you, son of man, that's Ezekiel, will it not be on the day when I take from them their stronghold, the joy of their pride, the desire of their eyes, their heart's delight, their sons and their daughters, that on that day he who escapes will come to you with information for your ears. On that day your mouth will be open to him who escaped, and you will speak and be mute no longer. Thus you will be a sign to them, and they will know that I am the Lord. So here's the plan now. Ezekiel is going to be, and he's not going to be completely mute as in he can't talk, because he's going to keep prophesying to other nations from chapter 25 to chapter 33. But here's what God is saying to him. Don't prophesy anymore to Israel, to Jerusalem. Don't say any more to them. So you got all these exiles sitting there, and God said, okay, today's it. The siege is going to happen, and you're going to be quiet. You know, he said, saying there, don't preach to them, don't tell them anything. You give them these examples, but then you're quiet. You don't give any more prophetic messages to Jerusalem. Look what he says. Until, he said, when this siege is over, when everything is burned, when everything is over, when everybody's dead, when Nebuchadnezzar's going back to Babylon with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when all that happens, God said, then a messenger is going to escape from Jerusalem. He's going to run back to you, and he's going to tell you that it's over. God said, then you can talk. Then you can talk to him. So in the meantime, while all this is happening, don't say anything. Now, chapter 25, he's going to say something to the Ammonites, and he's going to start prophesying against foreign countries. He's not talking to Israel, not talking to Jerusalem, but he's talking to foreign countries. He's not going to say anything to Israel again until chapter 33, which is 5 months in the future. So this siege of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar, January 15th, 586 BC, won't end till what, May? So May of 586 BC, it's all over with. And then this messenger comes back to Ezekiel in chapter 33 and says, hey man, it's all over. You know, it's the thing's over. Then Ezekiel says, okay, now I can prophesy to you guys again. And so when he starts prophesying to them again is in chapter 33, and he's going to start prophesying future. Stuff that is what we call eschatological, in our future, the eschaton, the end times, the tribulation, the millennial. He's going to start talking about all that stuff. So he's told them that this judgment's coming. Now today he said, it's here, judgment's here. And then he's going to be quiet. For 5 months, Nebuchadnezzar is going to lay siege to Jerusalem. People are going to die. The city's going to burn. Temple's going to fall. And then when it's all over and the dust clears, this guy's going to come back to Ezekiel in May and say it's all over with. Ezekiel's going to say, okay, now let me tell you guys what's going to happen in the future. Let me tell you what's going to happen next. And then he's going to start prophesying about Gog and Magog. He's going to start talking about the valley of dry bones. God is going to raise up that remnant. He's going to start prophesying all that future stuff, that even our future kind of stuff. But that's chapter 24. It's one parable, 2 action sermons that God is trying to get across that this is happening today. This is why it's happening today. Any questions or comments on chapter 24? And like I say, chapter 25 through 32 is all about foreign countries. I say foreign to Israel. And we'll get to those. All right. Well, I appreciate Oaks.
I probably missed it, but there in the first verse where it was talking about in the 9th year, how do we,
their calendar's different.
Timeline.
Yeah, their calendar's different. And we base everything off of 1 Kings 22:1. And if you look at that, then we can kind of backtrack a lot of dates. But this was pretty evident because of the way the Jewish calendar's set. And so we kind of, I'll get you a chart of it, and let's see what.
I think if you understand the timeline, it kind of helps.
Yeah.
Put the rest of it together.
It does.
Yeah.
You can kind of see how many months elapse, and you can tell. Anything else? All right, well, I appreciate y'all being here. Appreciate y'all being with us online. I'm going to sign off from y'all, and again, invite you back to be with us 10:15 on Sunday mornings, 6 o'clock Sunday night, and 6:30 on Wednesday nights. Well, I hope y'all have a great week. God bless.